Start in just a few minutes. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. We'll start in just a few. Good evening. Good evening. I'll give you all about 30 more seconds to join, and then we'll go ahead and start. All right, 15 more seconds, and then I'll start. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start. So, welcome to our virtual Gallier gathering. I'm Dr. Anastasia Scott, and we are the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. We have made Gallier gatherings free to you all in this virtual platform since April 2020, but it is not free for us. As a small museum trying to stay afloat during these evolving times, we have made our virtual lectures pay what you can to help us cover the cost associated with putting on this program, such as speaker honoraria. Your generosity is appreciated. Thank you to those who have made donations, and please consider a donation for future virtual lectures. Gallier House will be open on the weekend starting in June. This is the first reopening of Gallier House since the pandemic, so I am pleased to announce that beginning in June, on the weekends, Gallier House will now be open for tours. Please see our website for booking information. This lecture, Sick from Freedom, the Smallpox Epidemic of 1865-66, and the health of formerly enslaved people during the Civil War and Reconstruction. This lecture is based on his book, Sick from Freedom. Jim Downs uncovers how a smallpox epidemic took the lives of over 60,000 freed people. Jim Downs is the Gilder Lehrman National Endowment Professor of Civil War Studies and History at Gettysburg College. He is the author and editor of over 9 books, including Sick from Freedom, African American Illness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction, and the Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, Slavery, and War Transformed Medicine, which is on the origins of epidemiology. It will be published by Harvard University Press in September 2021. For those of you who are joining us for the first time for this virtual lecture, a little bit about Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. We are managed by the Women's Exchange. We preserve 2 19th century French Quarter homes, and through their architecture, collections, and history, inspire discourse about our collective past and its relevance to our present and future. Visitors, students, and researchers explore such diverse topics as the lives of the house's owners and enslaved people, free people of color, open heart cooking, mourning rituals, and the entrepreneurial pursuits of women. At the end of each Gallier gathering is a survey we send out, asking for your feedback. Please know that we read your feedback and try to make this content as relevant as we can. Please fill out the survey we send out after each Gallier gathering. Your feedback is valuable. Housekeeping. This talk will be recorded and available for viewing in 24 hours on our YouTube channel and website. Please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you won't miss out on any future recorded programming. If you have questions at any point during the lecture, please save them until the end or submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, I present to you Dr. Jim Downs.
Okay, well, first, let's see, am I muted? Am I here? Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Scott. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation. The only thing I would like better would be if I could be in New Orleans with you all. When I got the invitation, I was thinking, what a great opportunity to come to the French Quarter. But unfortunately, I'm not there. It's virtual, and that's okay as well. Today, I'm going to talk about the smallpox epidemic of 1862 to 1866 within the long history of the United States and even within the history of medicine. This is a relatively unknown epidemic. If we think about large medical crises or catastrophes that affected Black people, we know about the 1793 yellow fever epidemic. We know about Tuskegee in the 20th century. We even know about issues around HIV/AIDS later in the mid to late 20th century. But the smallpox epidemic is a relatively unknown, kind of surprising, and quite frankly, a poignant story in the history of the United States, particularly among African Americans. And I first came across references to the smallpox epidemic while doing research on the Civil War and the period thereafter, Reconstruction. And I started to piece together evidence in the National Archives that gave clues about the fact that there was, in fact, this major epidemic that took the lives of over 60,000 freed people. Now, when you read books, as I did when I was in graduate school for preparing for your orals, getting ready for your general exams, doing dissertation research, there's a ton of stuff on what historians refer to as the transition from slavery to freedom. And there's a lot of books that talk about how revolutionary this period was, largely because this was a period that gave way to the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which provided birthright citizenship, and then the 15th Amendment, which provided Black men with the right to vote. And so most of the books that sort of attend to this moment deal with the political aspects of Reconstruction and talk about this glorious sort of unprecedented moment in the United States that Black people got the right to vote. Yet buried in the National Archives are a few sources, relatively few sources, about the fact that a major epidemic exploded as these political changes were taking place. And the way that I uncovered that, maybe we could look at the first slide, was reading through the papers of someone named Harriet Jacobs. And Harriet Jacobs, I mean, even if you don't get anything from my lecture tonight, you can get something about Harriet Jacobs, because Harriet Jacobs was a woman that was born into slavery, and she was faced sexual assault from her owner, that she ran away from her plantation. She goes into her grandmother's attic, and for over 9 years, she lives hidden in her grandmother's attic in North Carolina. And what happens is she stays there looking through the sort of the floorboards, watching her children coming in to visit their great-grandmother. She doesn't want to leave. And so ultimately she makes her way, before the war starts, she makes her way to the North. She's greeted by abolitionists. They encourage her to write her biography because it's a story about motherhood. It's a story about sexual assault and rape. And she's at first kind of uncertain to do it. but she eventually does it. But because she's considered a fugitive slave at the time, she writes under a name, Linda Brent. And so she writes this book. It's published on the eve of the American Civil War. It circulates during the war. And after the war, she goes to Alexandria, Virginia, to help formerly enslaved people who escaped from slavery and are living in what is basically a refugee camp, which is on the perimeter of the Union Army camp. And ultimately, what happens with Jacobs is really an interesting story, is that throughout the rest of the 19th and into the 20th century, because she wrote under a pseudonym, the pseudonym Linda Brent, no one believed that she actually authored her autobiography. They believed, people at the time believed, a white woman pretended to be Black and wrote her own book, sort of like the recent scandal of Rachel Dolezal, of a white woman trying to be Black in order to make money. So people dismissed her. When I was in the National Archives, and in the Massachusetts Historical Society and other repositories, I start finding letters written by Harriet Jacobs, but she used a hybrid name, Linda Jacobs, which was both Linda Brent and Harriet Jacobs, and she put them together, and she wrote under this other pseudonym, and she talked about the devastating health conditions that formerly enslaved people faced during the Civil War and thereafter. And so that became my clue to sort of begin to ask questions about health conditions of formerly enslaved people. And it was also an interesting moment because at the time, as we could see today, even with the high rates of coronavirus, et cetera, the people fall back on a racialist understanding, a racial ideology to rationalize the spread of COVID. They did in the 19th century too. So they would often say, you know what, Black people were better off left in slavery. This was a pro-slavery parable. And so they would say, the fact that they're all becoming sick and they're dying during the Civil War and Reconstruction, it's a result of their innate inferiority. Meanwhile, people like Jacobs and her friends who were abolitionists were saying something quite different. They were saying they were fit for citizenship. They were ready for this. And so at that moment, you can kind of begin to see how ideas of health became politicized, that what was actually happening on the ground became interpreted by either pro-slavery advocates as proof that Black people were inferior, or by their antagonist, abolitionists, who said, let's not really emphasize this. Let's talk about the fact that Black people are ready for freedom. And so what that did was, it actually took the few clues, the few details surrounding the medical crises that unfolded during this period, and it hid them in the archives. It concealed them. And so when I found Jacobs talking about it, I realized that discussions about health were ideological, they were politically infused, and that they often obscured what actually happened on the ground. And since people later proved the authenticity that she wrote her own autobiography, I became emboldened to believe that her reports about the devastating conditions that free people faced in the immediate wake of emancipation were in fact accurate. So one point to remember and one point to think about is, especially as I'm here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where the major Battle of Gettysburg was fought, is that we often have a kind of idea about the Civil War. We have an idea that most men died at the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of Antietam or any number of other battles that happened in the Eastern Theater or even out far into the West. But in actuality, the secret is, and it's known among historians, it's just not broadcast that much, is that more soldiers died from what was referred to as camp diseases. And camp diseases was a term that basically we could sort of describe as infectious disease. And in the 19th century, they didn't have clear pathologies on what various diseases were. So everything got kind of like thrown into this umbrella. So there were things like pneumonia and dysentery and diarrhea and yellow fever and smallpox. And so more soldiers did not die heroically on the battlefield. More soldiers died from these camp diseases, from infectious disease. And part of that, and part of the reason for this explosion of infectious disease, well, there are many reasons, but one of the major reasons was the Civil War unfolded before the advent of bacteriology, the understanding of germs or germ theory. So most people didn't really understand how disease spread. It reminds me a lot of what happened when COVID happened, and was part of the reason I can sort of talk about this during the Q&A. And I had found myself like screaming into the night, because when COVID first broke out, people said, well, this is brand new. We have no idea what this is. I have no idea. And it was like this sort of crisis, this intellectual crisis. They didn't understand what COVID was. To be clear, they knew a lot about what COVID was. They knew it was a virus, not a bacteria. They knew it was an upper respiratory infection. And they knew that it even sort of functions similar in terms of the spread and transmission like the flu. Now, Dr. Birx got criticized for saying that, but from an epidemiological perspective, the flu was a good analog, a good analogy to sort of explain how the infection spread. Nevertheless, even if we didn't know a lot about how COVID behaved, we generally knew that it was a virus, and we generally knew that it spread from person to person. People are now finally admitting, after a long amount of time, that while it can be found on surfaces or on groceries or other things, it can't really infect you from that. We knew a lot about COVID, even if we argued we didn't. However, in the 19th century, when smallpox, when cholera, when dysentery, pneumonia, when these malaria, when these infectious diseases spread, they had no idea if it was a virus, which spread from person to person, or if it was a bacterial infection that resulted from an object, or that could be passed on from person to person, or could be passed on from objects. They didn't understand. And so as a result, that's part of the reason why there was this major death toll among soldiers. For newly freed people, for people who were enslaved, who become free as a result of their own actions, who become free as a result of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, who become free as a result of the advances of the Union Army into the Southern Territory, we have this sort of mythical understanding about that moment. And we see it as triumphant. And it was. It was triumphant because it finally shattered the institution of slavery. And people were able to leave this institution. They were able to leave the plantations and the homes and the violent people who had subjugated them for centuries. However, that triumphant moment was short-lived, in large part because, and this is the major question that people must consider, is where did formerly enslaved people sleep the day after they liberated themselves from chattel slavery? Where did they find food? Where did they find clothing? To compound matters, they entered into a world, as I've already described, that was plagued by infectious disease. They entered into a world where Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers were dying more from dysentery, smallpox, and pneumonia than they were from battle. So they enter into this world already compromised, which is to say nothing of the fact that the institution of slavery often left them without the basic necessities to survive. And so what happens is, and this is a sort of interesting moment, again, that doesn't get a lot of attention among historians, because we want to celebrate, as we should, the coming of the 14th Amendment, which is birthright citizenship, the coming of the 15th Amendment, which is suffrage. But we have to realize that when we think about those major revolutionary changes along a timeline, a political timeline, that's a very short period to say, wow, people were enslaved in 1858, and by 1868, they were considered citizens, and they were considered, Black men could vote. Within a 10-year span, the same population who was born into bondage could now be elected to Congress. That is a revolution, absolutely. But outside of a political timeline, on a medical timeline, if we think about that chronology, 1862, 1863, 1864, the day after you're emancipated, a week after one is emancipated. Where do they find the basic necessities to survive? And what's interesting, and this is the piece of history that we don't know that much about, and it's a new work is explaining it. There's new work by Thavolia Klimpf coming out. I talk a little bit about it in my book, but the freed people are cast, according to 19th century military parlance, as contraband. So let's look at the first slide here. And what happens is, and it begins actually in your city, New Orleans. Benjamin Butler takes over New Orleans in 1862. He faces large numbers of free people who migrate from the Natchez district up into New Orleans. And when they arrive in New Orleans, the Union has sort of taken over the city. And all of these freed slaves fled the city looking for opportunity, looking for freedom, looking for an escape from both their planters, the slaveholders, but also protection from the Confederates. And so what Butler says, I think he says it in Virginia, the Second Confiscation Act, but he's ultimately in New Orleans, so I wanted to tie that in. He has this idea, it's called the Second Confiscation Act. It predates the Emancipation Proclamation, and basically it says this: you, formerly enslaved person, can enter into a Union area if you promise to provide labor for the Union Army. And that labor could be digging ditches, laundering clothes, cooking. It was mostly very hard, grueling physical labor. And in exchange for that, we will provide you rations, we will provide you with basic necessities to survive. Unfortunately, however, the military never anticipated that the war would last this long. So the military didn't really even have enough supplies for their troops, let alone this brand new population that arrived. So what you begin to see during the Civil War is the creation of these makeshift camps that appear often adjacent to Union camps. And they're essentially refugee camps. They're called by Butler contraband camps, a term that leaves unsettled whether or not Black people are free or enslaved. Now, I got to tell you something. Some of these pictures, I want to say these are like gentrified refugee camps, okay? Because you might say, well, that's actually not so bad. That looks like a weekend of camping. But these were these images actually preserve these images that we have that preserve this moment are often the more grandiose. That is to say, the tents are half decent, people are able to huddle together in small areas, but ultimately they're quarantined into these regions, and they're forced to follow military rule in order to get food and in order to survive. What begins to happen is, and we don't really know the actual origin, this is where it's actually almost identical to COVID, which is to say, well, we say, COVID originated in Wuhan, it eventually moved from Wuhan, and then it goes to New York. I mean, what is the migratory trail of this? It's unclear actually how it moves. People theorize about this. So historians can only do the same with smallpox, or I could only do the same with smallpox, which is in 1862, when Abraham Lincoln is preparing to issue his preliminary emancipation, basically what he does is not too far from the White House. There is a barracks where a number of formerly enslaved people have fled, and they are living basically in an empty lot. And the Medical Society of Washington, D.C. begins to realize that a huge epidemic of smallpox breaks out among them. White Washingtonians begin to do a very famous 19th century sort of practice, which is to hang a sort of white a flag outside of their house to say that maybe someone there is infected. And so we can begin to see that a lot of the same ways that we thought about quarantine and infection and lockdowns happen in Washington, D.C. Now, white people were protected because they could say quarantined in their homes and they had access to basic necessities and they could survive. But living in an abandoned lot with basically the clothes on their back that they had as they try to escape from slavery, the epidemic sort of accelerates among them. And what we begin to sort of see records of, again, if you think about how do we piece together, how I pieced together this epidemic, was just clues that Harriet Jacobs left, clues that other white women who traveled to the South to work as teachers, they wrote about it. A lot of people didn't want to write about it because they were afraid if we emphasize the fact that Black people are dying at high rates, it's going to play into that pro-slavery parable that Black people are better left under slavery. And yet I was able to piece together evidence. And what I noticed was the smallpox epidemic spreads from Washington, D.C. in 1862. By 1863, evidence shows that it's in Virginia. By 1864 to 1865, it spreads to the Carolinas and to Georgia. The estimates there, the numbers there are stunning. The Sea Islands, these are the islands that dot the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. These were major plantation districts. These are places where many formerly enslaved people are living. In fact, the federal government and the military and Northern teachers refer to this as the rehearsal for Reconstruction, as the Port Royal experiment. They're thinking, okay, the war is going to end. How are we going to get Black people back to the plantation? Well, let's bring three major groups in. We have the formerly enslaved people. We're going to bring in the military to make sure that they actually get back to work. It's another piece that people don't talk about, is that returning formerly enslaved people to the plantation led the federal government to do it by gunpoint and by military necessity. So this was also something we don't think about how formerly enslaved people were forced under gunpoint to go back to planting cotton after the war. And then there were teachers, because there was this sort of sentiment among former abolitionists who said, you know what, we really want formerly enslaved people, Black people, to have the benefits of citizenship, and we want them to learn how to read and write, so we're going to establish schools. So those three authorities are there, which is great for me as a historian because they leave notes. And what we have found, or what I have found, is that 800 people a week died of smallpox in the Sea Islands. And then I found evidence further in Mississippi, something like 550 Black people to 37 white people died. And part of that is because when we think about the spread of infectious disease, one of the major conduits that accelerates something like smallpox is population movement. So part of the way that formerly enslaved people envisioned and enacted their freedom was to try to move from location to location. Well, that actually exacerbated the spread of the virus from one place to the next. The second is, if we go back to that other slide, the previous slide, because they're in these refugee camps, they are there because they are politically quarantined. But that political quarantine actually leads to the virus accelerating among this population. In other words, they're forced to live there and they can't leave that location. When smallpox breaks out among the Union Army and the Confederate Army, and I found references to this in the War of the Rebellion, the major encyclopedic set of documents. In this, I would give this talk, I've been giving this talk for like 10 years, different parts of it. And I would say the next part, and people would say, yeah, okay, that's interesting. It's an interesting historical fact, and they would move on. Now I think maybe it'll resonate differently with you in the context of COVID. That is to say, when Union officials or Confederates, different political ideologies, different armies, but both were similar in this capacity, when they saw 2 or 3 cases of smallpox, they immediately took those infected people, those infected soldiers, they removed them from the camp, and they placed them in what was called a smallpox hospital. And a smallpox hospital in 1863, 1864, 1865 is basically just a bunch of tents far removed from everyone else. But they didn't understand necessarily entirely. They had a somewhat of an understanding of contagion, but it wasn't entirely clear. They also had an understanding of miasma. There are these different theories about maybe how infectious disease were spreading. They didn't know. But the one thing they did know was that quarantine was an efficacious protocol to thwart the spread of a virus. So if you just took the infected soldier, removed them from everybody else, then there was the possibility that it wouldn't spread. Now, because formerly enslaved people are in a political quarantine space. There was no way to actually quarantine them. And so even though quarantine as an effective protocol had been around since the Middle Ages, Black people did not have the access to or the benefits of quarantine. And so as a result, the virus, like wildfire among this congested population in this relegated space. So that's an important piece to know. When it starts spreading like wildfire among Black people, observers notice it and they come up with different rationales. They say, first, Black people are inferior than white people, and they're more susceptible to something like smallpox. Second, they look closely at the living arrangements of Black people. And instead of saying, wow, they have poor tents, or they don't have enough food, or they don't have enough clothing, or they're congested in this environment, or they don't have access to quarantine, they immediately start talking about sex. They immediately go to the fact that Black people are living promiscuously. Now, promiscuously does not necessarily mean, it doesn't have the same sort of connotation as it does today about sexual intercourse per se. It's more of an illusion. It's more about the intermingling of men and women. So they would say, well, these are promiscuous places, which could connote sex, but it also could connote something else, which is basically that they don't like this idea that unmarried men and women are congregating together. And so they begin to sort of say that this is a punishment from God. And within the 19th century, that's not a completely outrageous idea. In fact, many people think throughout the 19th century that the spread of infection is the result of God. People probably said it around COVID. I know they definitely said it around HIV/AIDS. So this idea of a spiritual supernatural force is the cause for this epidemic is one thing. But then we start looking at the numbers. Can we go to the statistical slide that I have? Okay, one more. Okay, so these are the kinds of records. When I tell people, oh, I work on race and medicine in the 19th century, people say, oh, wow, that's really interesting. You must be reading all of these vivid, illustrative accounts of how doctors have these sort of prurient descriptions of Black bodies. And the answer is no. These are the kinds of reports that are set up. And basically, this follows what early epidemiologists would refer to as nosological reports, which is basically a fancy way of saying they just are capturing numbers. And it's unclear what these numbers mean, but numbers like number of infected, number died, number who were admitted to the hospital, number who left the hospital. Now, you don't know if the number that the guy or woman who was admitted to the hospital, who was infected, was released the next day or the next week or whatever, because these numbers are not detailed. It's actually kind of confusing. So I can't even try to explain what they're for. They're really just counting the number infected, they're counting the number that are hospitalized, and they're counting the number that are leaving the hospital. Now, the question is, well, why does that matter if the numbers are confusing? There's two reasons why it matters. One, the federal government, in an unprecedented move by 1865, 1866, recognizes that there's a massive epidemic spreading throughout the post-war South. They see the smallpox epidemic. Some people chalk it up to intermingling of men and women. Some chalk it up to inferiority. But everyone can agree that this is not going to be good for getting Black people back to the plantation South in order to replant the profitable cottonseed. And so the numbers are really about trying to get a sense of what could actually be the labor force. How many people can actually go and work? And so they're trying to sort of tabulate this as a way of thinking about the labor force. Now, there's something else interesting that happens. As I mentioned before, in Mississippi, you would have like 550 Black people infected with smallpox and 37 white people. Now, if you look at a report like this, and this was a report on white people, if you have that statistical knowledge that 550 Black people are infected compared to 37 whites, it begins to sort of trigger a sort of racial ideological understanding that smallpox is splitting and that along racial lines, that there's something about Black people that they're more vulnerable to it. Now, I could tell you the reason why they're more vulnerable to it is because they, as I said in the very beginning, they don't have access to basic necessities. They're placed in these refugee camps. There's an unclear understanding about the spread of infectious disease. It's before the development of epidemiology and germ theory. Those are all the reasons why it's spreading, but it begins to play into an understanding that Black people are inferior and that they are going to go extinct. And in the 19th century, so this is what I would say to my students, if it's 1866, and someone's witnessing a large population of people beginning to die out, and they argue that there is extinction, what would be the concrete evidence in their imagination that would support that claim? And the answer is basically what's happening to the Native American population on the East Coast, which is that you're seeing a large because of settler colonialism, because of the same kind of political and social forces that Native Americans are facing, you're seeing large numbers of Native Americans dying out in the northeastern part of the United States, and even in the southeastern part of the United States, but not in the Southwest. The Comanches are thriving during this period, but on the East Coast, there is a huge population decline. That population decline provides an important context for how people begin to rationalize the smallpox epidemic. And I'm just going to read this one paragraph from my book because the New York Times talks about this, and I think it's important, and it relates to Louisiana. So let's see. A Union officer stationed in Louisiana that spring respectively suggested that an order declaring vaccination to be a military necessity, which he argued would save many lives among these poor people. The New York Times echoed the need for vaccination in 1866. Quote, "The Freedmen's Bureau can do as much as good in seeing to the vaccination of the Blacks as in any other way. Unless something is done for them, the Negro population of the South will begin to melt away in freedom," end quote. So that's on page 105 of my book. And so ultimately we see a lot of resonance to the contemporary moment about vaccination and how that's not a new thing. And I'm happy to delve into those questions or delve into that subject during the Q&A. But for now, I just want to say that this is part of what happens with the smallpox epidemic, is that ultimately it doesn't really end. A lot of people end up dying from it. And what happens is it gets read and understood and interpreted purely as a Black disease. Now, at the same time, 1866, this is another sort of shocking moment in medical history. A cholera pandemic explodes in the South. And the cholera pandemic begins in Asia, similar to COVID, as people have suggested. It moves into Europe. It travels, cholera is a waterborne bacterial infection. It travels from Asia to Europe. It crosses over the Atlantic into Canada. It comes down into the New York ports in Canada, and it's being carried by ships in infected water. And then from Canada to New York, and then New York into most of the South, and then from the American South into the Caribbean, into Mexico, and then into South America. So it's a major pandemic. It's not the first cholera pandemic of the 19th century. In fact, it's the fourth. I could talk about it more. It's in my new book called Maladies of Empire. But the point is that the cholera epidemic frightens people all over the world because, again, unlike COVID, which we know is a respiratory infection, they had no idea what was causing cholera spread. And so the military, under the Surgeon General's office, which at that time is basically a sinecure for retired military officials, deploys doctors and others, medical officials throughout the South in places like New Orleans. And they begin this massive effort to clean it up, to basically enact a campaign, and because they believe that sanitation will create better health conditions which will prevent the spread of cholera. And in fact, it does. So it's really an interesting moment. I've been thinking about this a lot recently in light of the COVID pandemic. The cholera pandemic ultimately overshadows the ending of the smallpox smallpox epidemic. And so if you look at the next slide of the man, or could we go to the guy, the man, I'm sorry, yeah, here we go. This slide is actually from the end of the 19th century. So, and it's from the Florida Historical Society. Smallpox continues to spread among the Black population throughout most of the 19th century. It doesn't really end. People think that it ends when, and it doesn't end. It just, the focus, the medical focus, the governmental focus, the journalistic focus shifts to covering the cholera pandemic, and it obscures the spread of smallpox. In fact, I was reading something earlier today, and in Kentucky in the 1890s, there's still evidence that, and it's always couched as a surprise, wow, the smallpox is spreading among the Black community. It continues to spread among Black people down into the 20th century. I gave a talk at in Charleston at the South Carolina Medical School a couple of years ago. And a woman told me that her great-grandfather or her grandfather had smallpox, and that many people in his community did. So it's an epidemic that stays with us. I'm going to give you one last story before I finish, because I'm careful on the time. And the smallpox epidemic is a major medical crisis. I'm hoping that it eventually makes its way into textbooks. I'm hoping that we write about it, and we talk about it, and we teach it, and we know it, because it's an important chapter in US history that often doesn't get the attention that it deserves. But it is not the only medical problem that faced formerly enslaved people. One family that I tracked was the Miller family. And it was a Black family, which actually was surprising, because most families, as we know, during slavery were separated, especially in decades before the war, because they were brought from the Upper South to places like New Orleans, where they were sold in order to be auctioned off into plantations in Southwest Georgia, throughout Mississippi, et cetera. So I found a family, the Miller family, that actually remained intact despite the domestic slave trade, et cetera. And they make their way to one of these Union camps in Kentucky. And Kentucky at that particular time, in 1864, in November of 1864, slavery was still legal. It had not been abolished by the Emancipation Proclamation, because Kentucky was a border state. And so what happens is, Joseph Miller and his family are living in a tent, and they're living in a tent among all these other families and all these other people who have escaped from slavery and have made their way to live next to the Union camp for protection from Confederate guerrillas, protection from slaveholders, etc. And on one morning in November of 1864, Miller's woken up by a mounted Union guard. And the Union guard says to him, "You and your family need to leave." And Miller he's a Black soldier, and he turned to the guard and he says, "I'm a soldier in the United States Army. I've been promised that my wife and our 4 children could stay in this tent as long as I served in the military." And the mounted guard says, "Your wife and your children need to leave, or I will shoot every last one of them." And at that point, Miller looks out, and he can see wagons full of formerly enslaved people moving out of the camp. And at that point, he realizes, he says, one more time, "My son is very sick." And his son was 6 years old. "He'll starve to death. He'll freeze to death." Actually, he says he'll freeze to death if he's forced to leave. And again, the Union official says, "I will shoot you. I will shoot them if they don't do it." So Miller has no choice. He has to put his family into the wagon and send them off. So Miller works that day. He performs whatever menial tasks he has to, whatever labor he has to. And at night, he goes in search of his family. He hears a rumor that his family are in a boarding house about 10 miles from the camp. So let's all think about how long it is in November when it's completely dark. By 4 or 5 o'clock, you got to walk now 10 miles in an unknown territory to a boarding house in the cold. He gets there. He scans the room for his family. He sees a group of Black people huddling around the fire in a corner. And then he looks and he sees in another corner his wife and his children. So he walks over to them and his wife looks up to him and she says, "Our son has died." So now Miller is faced with not only dealing with the grief that his child has died, but he now also has to deal with the fact of what will happen with his son's body. So Miller now needs to walk another 10 to 12 miles back to the camp in the cold. And this son is 6 years old. So this is a fairly sizable human being. This in itself is an arduous thing. So the Union camp, where the bonfires were blazing and that once represented freedom, now represent a biological struggle and crisis for humanitarian crisis for Miller. So Miller manages, despite the ground being frozen solid, to bury his child. And then, according to the Sexton records, which I discovered later, within 2 weeks, his other children die. So his first child dies in November of 1864. By the early part of December, 2 of his other children die. Around Christmas, his wife dies. And then by the early part of January of 1865, the ending of the war will be only in 3 or 4 months. His final child dies. And by the middle part of January, according to the Sexton's records, Joseph Miller dies. So here's a family that actually died, not from the smallpox epidemic, not from the gunfire of the Confederates, but actually as a result of the failure of the federal government to imagine the humanitarian crisis that emancipation would engender. And basically they died from starving to death, infectious disease, and sort of a failure of having basic necessities. So this is the story of freedom that we need to really, I think, grapple with, which is it's the story of a major epidemic that we need to understand and recognize, but it's also the story of people dying from things like starvation and dysentery. So years later in 2012, in Kentucky at Camp Nelson, there has been a major effort to commemorate the lives of formerly enslaved people who died in the transition from slavery to freedom. And I was able to find, we could just go to the next slide, a tombstone that was erected for Joseph Miller. And you could see here, it says Joseph Miller. It was really a sort of a breathtaking moment for me as a historian to find this. And then USCT, it's United States Colored Troops. So there is a commemorative tribute to him, but to all of the women and children who died, there's basically just a plaque that sort of marks their death. But we don't, again, the numbers they suggest are around 800, but again, the numbers are always unclear at this period. But this is part of the larger history of health among formerly enslaved people during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Thanks.
Wow, Dr. Downs, thank you so much. I'm just gonna leave up this PowerPoint. I mean, this particular slide, if you wanted to contact, that is his Twitter handle at Jim Downs 1. And if you'd like to contact Dr. Downs, this is also his email. So I'm just gonna leave it up for a few more seconds.
And also this is, I feel like, can you put the screen back on me just because I forgot to do this?
Yeah, no worries.
But this is the copy, I mean, this is the book. It's all the research comes out of, and I didn't put this in the slideshow, but I guess, yeah.
Which one?
Oh, it's just me. You would have to put the screen back.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So yeah, I was doing that. I was going to stop sharing my screen. Sorry.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, this is the book. Everything is based on this. There's so much more there. I hate to appear like I'm somebody from QVC. My mother's got QVC all the time. So now I feel like I'm talking about my book. I'm like, here's the book. But in other words, I only scratched the surface tonight. There's so much more here. There's so many more details. There's stuff about New Orleans, and you can get it on Amazon, wherever you buy your books.
Wow. So I'll just get right into the first question. We do have a question. Thank you all. So at this time, this is the perfect time for you all to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. So I'll ask the first one.
Sure.
When you think of the various iterations of Reconstruction from the 19th century to now, thinking of Samuel Kilton Roberts Jr.'s book, Infectious Fear and the COVID Crisis Now, do you think that robust public health policy is a demand for what W.E. Du Bois came to call abolition democracy? If yes, why?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, I think I understand most of the question. I mean, I think that ultimately what Sam Roberts shows is, who actually was one of my teachers when I was in grad school. I had finished my exams, which means I was done courses, and he was on my Professor Roberts was on my dissertation committee, which then meant that he was like, well, you need to take my class. And I'm like, oh, we're back into coursework. And I think what he's doing in his book, and I think what is really important, are a couple of things, which is to say that when we talk about poor health, when we talk about problems among Black people in terms of epidemic disease, whether it's smallpox or TB, we can't just look at it from a laboratory perspective. We can't just look at it from a medical perspective. We really need to pay attention to the social context of it, to how it's playing out. What is the housing for Black people in Baltimore like? What is their access to medical care? People immediately want to see, oh, there's a lung disease, there's pulmonary problems. Let's immediately start making some kind of case about biological differences between Black and white people, when in fact, really what we're talking about is how does poverty, how does lack of knowledge, and then even in his case, how is the proximity of the Black neighborhood to something like Johns Hopkins, helping people there understand something about TB. So I think that that's a piece of it. But I would also say, I mean, about the Du Bois piece, there is adjacent to every major political turning point in Black political history is normally a similar medical episode that has gone sort of overlooked. And so one of the things that's happening today with COVID is that on some level among certain people, it's putting to sharp focus the poor conditions of Black people today. But those were there. I mean, in other words, like, why is COVID spreading among the Black population? It's not spreading because Black people are different. It's because they entered the epidemic with at a disadvantage. And so, and then even during the epidemic, I mean, this is the piece that I'm always talking about. During the epidemic, when everybody else was sort of lounging around and kind of joking about quarantine, like, I've turned my garage into a fitness center, you know, I'm making banana bread with my family, we're Instagramming it, it's cute. You have Black families of 5 that were already living in poor conditions, crowded in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York, on a floor with 10 other Black families, in a building with 100 other families, sharing one elevator, and then being forced to go back to work, and then being called euphemistically essential workers, when in fact they became more vulnerable and susceptible to COVID. And then months later, when the numbers of COVID infections increased among Brown and Black communities, the argument was, well, wait, is there some racial piece to this? There's no racial piece to this. It's like they didn't have the access and the opportunity to quarantine. They entered into the environment, into the epidemic already at a disadvantage, you know? So there's a class component that we have to always think about when we're talking about epidemic disease.
Wow. I'll move straight into the next question. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a different understanding of the endurance of Black people's bodies at different stages of life? Did racial ideology hold that elderly Black ability to resist illness was different?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. So there's 4 million formerly enslaved people in the South. There's tons of doctors, there's tons of journalists, there's tons of people who are talking about this. major medical catastrophe, and it varies. There's definitely people in New Orleans who are making an argument about immunity. They're making either they want, because of yellow fever, they've said that Black people are more immune because they, for whatever reason. All of this is not true. All we know is that some Black people who may have been exposed to yellow fever at one point in their lives have developed an immunity towards it, but that often gets racialized and it gets medicalized, and it's often not true. I mean, what we really see, I mean, and this is something I didn't get to talk about, is there is a major question about elderly freed people during this time, disabled freed people, because the government, the federal government, is attempting to, let me reframe that. When the federal government attempts to rebuild the South, they want to create a healthy labor force. And so all of the people who don't fit into the Northern understanding of what they define as able-bodied, which is normally male, which is normally between the ages of 12 and 64, they are sort of placed outside. They don't know what to do with them. So what the federal government does, and my book talks about this, it's kind of fascinating. They create the first ever system of national health care in the South. They build something like 40 hospitals. So if you look at it on the surface, you're like, wow, 40 hospitals, that's remarkable. That's an unprecedented moment in American medical history and American political history. But these hospitals were constructed to help create a healthy labor force. That is to say, these hospitals were designed to be shelters for elderly free people, orphaned children, disabled free people, and they had all mentally and physically disabled free people. And so the construction of the hospitals was not really a humanitarian effort as much as it was to separate the Black population from those who could work to those who could not work, which is actually kind of in the context of what happens with 19th century hospitals in general, in both the North and the South. They're often not built because people care about providing medical care, but they're built to help facilitate the creation of a labor force.
I had a comment. I normally don't do comments, but this I mean, it's just, we don't have any other questions, Dr. Johns. Now I have questions. It's so good. So I'm just going to say the comment because there aren't any more questions. Now I have a whole bunch of questions. So if you all don't give any more, I'll fill some of it. I'm not going to do all of my questions, but I will fill some of it. This is so good. Comment, not question. Thank you, Dr. Downs. I had no idea about the tremendous impact of smallpox during this period after the war. I had read Harriet Jacobs' book, but it was some time ago, and I don't remember the discussion of smallpox. I will definitely find your book. The parallels of smallpox after the Civil War to COVID are astounding. Such an important discussion that more people need to hear. So I did.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So Jacobs is in my book, and she talks about the smallpox. I have her in reference to the mortality. In fact, she witnesses and she describes wagons full of people dying at 30 or 40 a day in Alexandria, which is right outside of Washington, D.C. But you didn't miss anything in her autobiography, because her autobiography is just about slavery. Now, Jean Yellen wrote a book called, I could just put it in the chat. Jean Yellen wrote the biography on Jacobs, and there will be some references, I think, to some of the medical issues. The point is, I was a research assistant for Jean Yellen, and I was assigned to study Harriet Jacobs after she wrote her autobiography, when she goes to Alexandria and she starts to build a school with her daughter, Louisa, and they get sidetracked. See, they want to build a school to help free people become literate, and they immediately realize they need to instead provide blankets and clothing and other materials in order for free people to survive. So it's in her correspondence and in her notes, some of which are actually available, documenting the American South and UNC, University of North Carolina's webpage. You could find references there to what she calls smallpox ravaging. But it's really in my book, and not in hers. I mean, just because her book is just about slavery.
You know, what's interesting about what you just said is it sort of parallels this discussion of urban education. So we're talking about, how can we educate a lot of the urban low-income African-American students when sometimes they come in and they're not, they need this understanding, or they need basic things like the free breakfast program, So I think that statement about, you come to educate, but there are far more issues facing them when they got there than just, okay, let me get you a book and educate. But no,
that's right.
Before you can even pay attention to me, there are some basic humanitarian needs that need to be addressed before I can even get there.
100%. And also, yeah, I mean, that's spot on. Exactly. And that's what these Northern teachers faced when they arrived in the South, was the fact that there was a medical crisis. And it's also really interesting that the notion of public education takes off as a result of Reconstruction and freed people. Most people don't realize that the notion of public schools develops as a result of this moment. There were schools in New York started by certain reformers, and his name's escaping me right now, but there's schools in Massachusetts. You have different reformers there doing it. And then of course there's private academies, but the notion that we need to build a public education system, responds to the fact that you have 4 million people who are enslaved, and they need tools beyond just performing manual labor. And so that's part of it. And once the government agrees to do that, then they begin to see and observe the sort of poor health conditions that free people face. And also, just really quickly, the schools. I wrote my master's thesis on the schools, and I did it from looking through the records of Hampton Institute, which was an HBCU, and all of the Black women who couldn't finish their degrees because they had to return home to take care of a sick parent, or they got married, or they didn't have enough money, but they continued to want to educate. And so they considered themselves Hampton graduates. And they wrote in the alumni notes about how they built schools in barns and sheds and Sunday schools. And so I think the other thing I want to really take away from this too is there is a response among Black people to constantly try to improve their situation, build schools, and respond to this humanitarian crisis. Jacobs is a Black woman. These Black women were building schools later. That's also another piece of it, that when we think about today, the sort of question about public education, we don't really emphasize how Black women have been for centuries the backbone of public education.
That's good. So another comment, and then comment/question. It's super interesting as there's a discussion of how the wealthy international travelers were initially responsible for the spreading of COVID internationally, and then it disproportionately impacted the poor. So it sounds similar to what you said about the spread of cholera.
Right. I mean, the thing is, no, it's interesting. I mean, I would say, as someone who studies the history of epidemiology, we like to tell stories about how things spread. We don't know how things spread. So yeah, on some level, yes, wealthy travelers could have brought COVID here. COVID came from China. These are narratives. These are narratives that are designed in order to rationalize and make sense of the pandemic. COVID-19, its very name is that it was sort of identified in 2019. Are we going to be able to find a strand earlier? There's a wonderful article by Monica Green in the American Historical Association where she's finding evidence of Black Death, which we only thought existed in one part of the world, but new DNA, but new RNA sort of evidence is actually showing it in different parts at different times. So I always am cautious as a historian to say, this is the starting point. I'm more into thinking of it as this is the story we tell. But it is, but the comment that the person asked is 100% right, that there is a kind of a class economic analogy there, or connection there.
Okay, thank you all for continuing to put in questions. So as they come in, I'll ask them. Otherwise, I have questions. I can keep going.
Okay.
I'll ask the next question that just came in. Thank you. How do you approach the archives of slavery as constructions of power that sought, as you have told us, to erase some of the histories of Black people?
Right. So the archives are a problematic place. And the worst thing we could do is rush into an archive and start collecting material and say, this is the way it is. I'm always reading the records critically. In fact, that's why I kind of started this story about Harriet Jacobs. If we just look at the archival evidence, there's a lot of stuff about the organization of the plantation labor system. There's a lot of stuff about schools. There's obviously a lot of stuff about the military. There's purposely, I would say, not a lot of stuff about the health conditions. In fact, because on one level, when pro-slavery people saw the health conditions, they said, see, got you. I knew, this actually supports their argument that Black people were childlike and dependent on white people and couldn't survive living alone. And then abolitionists, who are typically the champions in this story of slavery, kind of downplay it because they want to show evidence. And this is really interesting, like Jacobs, they want to show evidence of, look, Black people are learning how to read. They're in schools, they're getting married, they're building families, they're building their own churches. There's a lot of records about how Black people are putting their money together and building churches, which obviously is true, obviously happened, but it's ideological because it plays into this idea of like, look, Black people can be, they have the same values as us. They want to be organized around church. So I guess I would say that the very effort to excavate the story about medicine and health is a way to engage the archive in a way that the archive is not necessarily wanting to be engaged, because the archive does not open itself up as it does for the history of capitalism. I don't want to get too on this, but like so many historians are getting very excited. I'm writing about capitalism. You're writing about capitalism. And all those slaveholders are like, are clapping from their grave because they're basically saying, yes, I wanted you to read my papers. Yeah, you're calling me a bad guy. So what? The bottom line is that whole archive has opened up to historians of slavery in a much easier way, because that's how slaveholders wanted people to remember slavery, as an economic institution that was building the country. And that's how they wanted to see Black people, as sort of animated by their efforts. Whereas if you look at gender history, it opens the archive in a completely different way. Slaveholders aren't interested in the intimacy of family members. Slaveholders aren't interested in the ways in which women behave differently from men. That's an affront to the cataloging and the accounting of slavery. So in other words, I think that the answer to the question is, what questions do we ask as historians that force the archive to speak in ways that it doesn't want to speak or the ways that it wants to speak? The capitalism stuff, I get it. Like, yeah, you got to know the slave traders. You got to know about the economy. We have to understand why it matters. But we also have to understand when you ask that question, that thing's going to open up for you and it's going to be voluminous because they wanted it to be that way. They don't want health to be that way. They don't want sexuality to be that way. So it was covered. It was covert. It was like, think about what I've been trying to work on this project on mixed race people, biracial people. What happened in terms of, why there was this huge population of Black people? Look, they don't want to talk about it. They're acting like it's just an act of God, and it's not an act of God. So why? That is just asking the question, probing further, not to be proving it, not to say, oh, why do these people look this way or that people look that way? No, is that they don't want to talk about it. They do want to talk about how much money they have. And they don't care if you're castigating them as the evil person. They're happy that they're like being remembered. And that was my TED Talk. Honestly.
That's so good. Dr. Dobbs, let me just go to the next question. This is so good. Yeah. You mentioned cholera and the pandemic. You said the cholera pandemic overshadows the ending of the smallpox epidemic. So, and you said it really never ended. So
it ends like probably in 1970 when we have like our last few cases of smallpox.
Wow. So yeah. How was the vaccination process treated between it being overshadowed by the cholera epidemic in 1970, like you just said?
Right. So an epidemic ends when we say it ends. You know, it's like you can look at something like COVID, and rates of infection of COVID throughout April were close to 70,000 a day. 70,000 a day in October, November, that was like, we call that a third wave, second wave. That was a huge deal. But because the vaccinations were happening, some people downplay, not all people, but a lot of people downplay that daily rate of infection because the narrative, the story that we wanted to tell was a story about the effective vaccinations that developed, which were great and are important and are useful. But the numbers were actually really still high. So we make a narrative decision on what we're going to elaborate, on what we're going to tell. And so what happened is with cholera, because it was international and it showed evidence that it could infect white people, it became the focus of the federal government. It became the focus of the state government. And so rates of smallpox infection stopped being documented. And yet it continued to spread. It's almost like this. I mean, I haven't seen anyone who's written this paper, but I'm hoping someone will. 2 or 3 years before COVID broke out, what was the number one leading cause? I mean, the number one leading epidemic among Black women in the South, and it was HIV. Mm-hmm. So the New York Times wrote this huge story that HIV is no longer considered a white gay man's disease in like New York City or San Francisco. But in the rural South, it's largely infecting Black women. Now, that story, beep, it pops up for about 2 minutes, and then COVID comes along, and guess what? Black women are still getting affected by HIV, yet we don't tell that story. So the headline shifts, and when the headline shifts, we think it's over. But I guarantee you there's still rates of infection. Public health authorities have had to shift their sort of makeshift budgets, their meager budgets to respond to COVID. Doesn't mean that other infectious diseases have died out. It's just that they're not testing for it. I mean, think about how much testing was done for HIV. Think about how much, work was being done in public schools to give out information about condom usage and all that. All that's probably stopped in terms of wearing a mask. Does that mean that STIs are not spreading among people? No, they're still spreading. Does that mean CDC is not cataloging? It's not cataloging. Their focus went someplace else. So the reality of it is that these things don't really end, they just get overshadowed by other concerns. And so that's why I say it'll end when we say it ends, but we don't know. And smallpox, it continued to affect Black people. Now, in terms of vaccination, it's really problematic, and I don't want to get too into it, but the best way of stopping any virus from smallpox to COVID, it's you isolate the infected person. You take that person who's infected and you keep them isolated from everybody else for 2 weeks. So they're no longer infectious. And that's really going to help you a lot. So quarantine lockdown is an effective protocol for infected people. So that's part of it. The other part of it is they did things like arm-to-arm inoculation, which is they would take the lymph. So smallpox produces these vesicles on the skin, and it has like a little fluid inside. It's called lymph. They would basically remove it with a lancet, with a knife. They would take the lymph and they would inject it onto the arm of someone who was vulnerable. What that does is it creates a mild version of the virus so that the person can build an immunity towards it and not be threatened by it. So that's part of it. They also learn that cowpox, they start noticing that there are dairy maids, that people who are milking cows are exposed to cowpox. They find that they become immune to smallpox. So they start creating vaccinations that are based on cowpox. So in the 19th century, and I talk about this in my new book, Maladies of Empire. I got to do my QVC ad up in here. Okay. So I give much more detail about the vaccination inoculation. The point is, if I was in a medical history class, the historian would say, come on, you have to know there's a difference between inoculation and variolation and arm-to-arm inoculation. Look, these doctors talked about these terms interchangeably all the time. I've spent years working on this, and they will literally say vaccination and inoculation in the same sentence mean the same thing. They mean different things. Vaccination often means cowpox. Inoculation means often arm-to-arm lymph. Doesn't matter. 19th century, they're using both of the terms. That's kind of a preventative way. Some people with smallpox could, it's kind of like COVID. Like some people can kind of endure it and their body can build up, you know, a response, an immunological response and clear it. But, you know, a lot of people ended up dying from it. I mean, this was just, you know, it's weird. I don't want to get too into this, but I think about it all the time when I go into CVS. I'm like, if I have like a small like rash or I don't feel well, I'm like running to CVS like constantly. 19th century people dealt with a lot of shit is basically the best way of describing it. There was like no, you know, they had there's actually in New Orleans, you must go. There's an amazing pharmacy museum. You know, there's a right, but I mean, that is like, I've gone twice. I love it. Yes, there are remedies that people create, but mostly 19th century Americans endured pains and problems and medical issues in ways that we would go, I mean, I would go ballistic. I don't know about y'all, but I would go ballistic. So that's the other thing of it too. So that's part of the other reason why we see, you know, high rates of smallpox continuing.
Thank you. Next question. I was wondering about how illness that manifests on Black bodies became sensationalized. That is, a blind Black person is viewed as more supernatural. Does that occur in the archives? Does that occur in the archives you encountered?
Not in the archives I've encountered, because the people I'm looking at are military records. So in other words, if a physician saw what was called in the 19th century parlance, old grannies, it was what we would call nurses or midwives, Black women who had healing power, who knew how to heal, who knew how to deal with stuff. If a military official who, by the way, wanted to go home 2 months ago, encounters an epidemic outbreak among a group of people, and you got an old granny there, he's fine with it. He's not going to report it. He's like, look, she's taking care of it. I don't need to be here. This is proof I can go home. They're not ethnographers. They're not walking around the South going like, oh, let me talk to her, interview her, draw a sketch of her, learn what she's doing. They're beleaguered. They've just fought a war. They don't want to be in the South. So these records aren't commenting on it. The military records that I'm looking at aren't commenting on it. Now, are there other records that talk about this? There's a historian by the name of Abby Cooper, who's at Brandeis, who has a book coming out soon on conjuring and spiritual practice among Black people. Yes, then in the Works Progress Administration, that is to say the interviews conducted among formerly enslaved people in the 20th century, you might find more references there. But in the military records, not so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So next question, who was largely impacted by cholera?
Everyone in the world, everyone. It was like COVID, it was a pandemic. So it was everyone. It was just that the government was able to mount a pretty effective campaign to improve sanitary conditions. So they're doing things like sweeping and washing the streets with lime. Didn't stop cholera, but they're careful about water. cholera is being spread by water, and some of them know it's spread by water. And in my new book, I talk about the fact that some of them have even found a chemical that can purify the water. So as a result of that, that's kind of slowing the cholera pandemic down a little bit. So that's part of it. But cholera was terrifying because cholera was the kind of thing that if you ingested the bacteria, because it was in the water supply. So if you ingested it, you can leave for work in the morning and be fine, and then by the afternoon develop a headache and cramps, and by the early evening have really bad diarrhea. By the end of the night, be dead of dehydration, because they didn't know that's what, your body could probably pass it. Some people probably pass it if they remain hydrated. It's why, like, even if you're sick with a flu or something like that, you should always stay hydrated, but they didn't know that then. So that's why what terrified people was that someone was healthy in the morning, by the night they were dead. The next day they were dead.
Wow, thank you. You said in your talk, where you didn't say these exact words, but this is what I got from it.
Okay.
So the formerly enslaved people were vaccinated not so that they're not out of a public health emergency, but they were vaccinated to rebuild the South's economy so that they can go work on the fields. So that's what I got.
That's why we're vaccinated, girl. We're vaccinated to get back to work too. No one's caring about anybody being vaccinated today unless you can get back to work. I mean, yes.
So, with that being said, that makes me like rethink the Hayes-Tilden Compromise in the sense that it wasn't just to appease angry Southern white men. Now I'm wondering if all of this, based on what you said, like in your talk, I'm wondering if the Hayes-Tilden Compromise was about a little bit more than angry Southern white men.
Right. I mean, of course. I mean, this is the $1 million question. And this goes back to that question about the archive. The archive is going to open up the minute you start talking about the Compromise of 1877. The archive is going to have lots of stuff to say. But then there's a question about what was happening in terms of medical problems and medical issues that, in fact, informed and shaped their decisions. And what I do know is smallpox was still happening, but cholera so smallpox is happening. Cholera kind of dies out by the end of the 1860s. There's not really any references to it by 1870s. But by 1873, there's a yellow fever epidemic. And then there's another outbreak of yellow fever. I mean, definitely in Mobile and different places. So you're having other kinds of epidemic diseases exploding throughout the 1870s that are still shaping people's decisions. I mean, I would also say this is the point I would make, because yes, there's definitely the piece that you're gesturing towards, which I think is very smart and interesting. But I would say this piece about Black people. When we talk about Black people trying to get the right to vote and trying to get citizenship, we always see it as like they had this innate desire to get involved in politics and be involved in politics and, change their lives. My question is, and some of them historians ask this question all the time: how do Black people become politicized? It's like, how do people become politicized today? Some people became politicized with Trayvon Martin, right? Some people, it took George Floyd. Some people, it was Ferguson. It's like some people, it wasn't any of that. It was reading MLK 30 years ago. So the question always is, what makes you political? Is it the conditions in your life that you've witnessed that made you political, or were you inherently just always political? So Eric Foner would say, with his book on Reconstruction, the conditions of the 1860s made you political. Steve Hahn would say in his book on the Nation Under Our Feet, Black people have been political from the antebellum South to the Garveyite movement. So there's like a long thread of Black people being political. Okay, so the point is, what I would say, because I'm a Foner student, I was trained by Foner, like, how did Black people witnessing the devastating effects of the smallpox epidemic force them to get involved in politics?
Wow.
How did the devastation of not having food and not get people to be more political? In other words, how does the medical conditions, the health conditions of the South propel people into politics? And I think it's a really important question that we don't yet have the answer. It's often like one of the greatest books ever written, I think, about the civil rights movement is a book by Danielle McGuire called At the Dark End of Our Street, because basically what she says is, look, Black women were being sexually assaulted and raped, and they could not march openly on the street. They could not organize outdoor political meetings. So slowly but surely, they organized bus boycotts. And the bus boycott was, in fact, designed to end segregation because that was awful. But their motivation was not just about public accommodation, public transportation. It also resulted from them being the authors first of Me Too, but not being able to say it. And so, what fueled Black women's political activism is not just access to the back of the bus, it's also to stop the sexual assault of Black women. So she tells the great story about Reese Taylor, of a Black woman who is brutally gang raped. And the NAACP sends an investigator to take her story to help her. And the investigator is Rosa Parks. Mm-hmm. So Rosa Parks in the 1930s is collecting interviews of women who were gang raped in the South. So when she decides to not get off that bus, she's not just getting off that bus, refusing to get off that bus because she wants public accommodation for Black people. She's not getting off that bus because she knows that she needs to do something that's safe and, quote, respectable and strategic, that's going to give Black women the political power to stop them from being raped. So it's like, where do you see motivation in somebody like Rosa Parks? It's like, it's complicated. It's years. And so that's what I'm saying with medicine. Like, Black people are fighting for political mobilization. It's not just coming from one place. It's also coming from the kinds of things that they witnessed after the Civil War in terms of the medical calamities.
So good. Thank you. And this is the last question for the evening.
Yeah.
How were formerly enslaved with mental illness treated? Were there institutions for their care?
Right. So I would say a couple of different things. So it depends. And it's by the late 1860s, the Freedmen's Bureau, which had established hospitals throughout the South and asylums, realized it was going to be a temporary institution. And so what they were basically saying was they were trying to create some kind of policy with state and local governments that had asylums. And as I mentioned in my book, there's examples that, okay, there are these mentally disabled people, and for whatever reason, they're starting fires. So one of the reasons why these state institutions need to be integrated is that if you don't incarcerate these mentally disabled people, they are going to be a harm to the public. And so what you begin to see is like piecemeal negotiations done at the local and the state level to get Black people into those places. Now, the problem is, and this is where, like, I was an English major, so I'm always interested in words and interpretation and blah, blah. When someone calls a Black woman in 1866, quote, idiotic, now, I mean, they might have a pathology in their mind, but I'm also thinking about what made Black women appear, quote, idiotic, that she wanted to be free, that she was, looking for her children, that she refused to join a plantation labor force. I'm not discounting the fact that Black women suffer from mental disorders during this period. Absolutely. But I'm also saying we need to be careful about how people in power had the authority to castigate Black women and other people as mentally ill. There's a pernicious set of laws that get passed during Reconstruction called the apprenticeship law, which basically said that if a white person, and they had them in Louisiana, they varied by state, But if a white person who was a farmer noticed that a Black woman wasn't taking care of her children, he could confiscate the children and say he was provide them with a bed and food and clothing because she was not able to do it. Well, what was the purpose of the apprenticeship law? That they wanted to provide 3 square meals to a bunch of Black kids? Wrong. It was to lure the mother back to the plantation. So once the planter said she's incompetent, she's not capable, I then have the legal right to take her children. The state says yes, the city says yes, everyone says yes, and everyone's looking at the kids saying, well, they need something to eat. But really, the motivation was so that she's not going to like keep walking down the street searching for freedom. She's going to go to the plantation now too to be with her children. And now she's going to be locked in having to work back at the plantation. So it's entrapment. It's like a form of trapping her back in. So in other words, if you look at the record, lots of examples of Black women as incompetent to justify the apprenticeship laws. Similarly, Black women as mentally disabled, we got to be careful about that because they're throwing out these terms left and right.
That's good, Dr. Downs. We'll end there.
Thank you.
This is so good. I thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And that is very, very nuanced. It's very, very specific. And I will certainly be in touch. This is so interesting, Dr. Downs. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Expertise. Oh my gosh, this is so good. This is like, now I want to take your class. Look, this is so good. This is so good. So
thank you.
So thank you to Dr. Downs for your time. Thank you for you all that are still on the call, the attendees. Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this. I certainly did. So I just want to bid you all a good night. And Dr. Downs, I will definitely be. Thank you. You have a good evening. And everyone, have a good evening.
Have a good night. Ciao.